Section 52 of Unbeaten Tracks in Japan by Isabella L. Bird. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Hawaii in October 2012. Letter 40, Part 1. Lebunge, Volcano Bay, Yezo, September 6. Weary wave and dying blast sob and moan along the shore. All is peace at last. And more than peace. It was a heavenly morning. The deep blue sky was perfectly unclouded. A blue sea with diamond flash and a many twinkling smile rippled gently on the golden sands of the lovely little bay, and opposite, 40 miles away, the pink summit of the volcano of Komonotaki, forming the southwestern point of Volcano Bay, rose into a softening veil of tender blue haze. There was a balmy breeziness in the air, and tawny tints upon the hill, patches of gold in the wood, and the scarlet spray here and there heralded the glories of the advancing autumn. As the day began, so it closed. I should like to have detained each hour as it passed. It was thorough enjoyment. I visited a good many of the Mororan Ainos, saw their well-grown bear in its cage, and, tearing myself away with difficulty at noon, crossed a steep hill and a wood of scrub oak, and then followed a trail which runs on the amber sands close to the sea, crosses several small streams, and passes the lonely Ainu village of Maripu, the ocean always on the left and wooded ranges on the right, and in front an apparent bar to farther progress in the volcano of Uzutaki, an imposing mountain, rising abruptly to a height of nearly 3,000 feet, I should think. In Yezo, as on the main island, one can learn very little about any prospective route. Usually, when one makes an inquiry, a Japanese puts on a stupid look, giggles, tucks his thumbs into his girdle, hitches up his garments, and either professes perfect ignorance or gives one some vague second-hand information, though it is quite possible that he may have been over every foot of the ground himself more than once. Whether suspicion of your motives in asking, or a fear of compromising himself by answering, is at the bottom of this, I don't know, but it is most exasperating to a traveller. In Hakodate I failed to see Captain Blackiston, who has walked round the whole Yezo seaboard, and all I was able to learn regarding this route was that the coast was thinly peopled by Ainos, that there were government horses which could be got, and that one could sleep where one got them, that rice and salt fish were the only food, that there were many bad rivers, and that the road went over bad mountains, that the only people who went that way were government officials twice a year, that one could not get on more than 4 miles a day, that the roads over the passes were all big stones, etc., etc. So this Uzutaki took me altogether by surprise, and for a time confounded all my carefully constructed notions of locality. I had been told that the one volcano in the bay was Komonotaki, near Mori, and this I believed to be 80 miles off. And there, confronting me, within a distance of 2 miles, was this grand, splintered, vermilion-crested thing, with a far nobler aspect than that of the volcano, with a curtain range in front, deeply scored, and slashed with ravines and abysses whose purple gloom was unlighted even by the noonday sun. One of the peaks was emitting black smoke from a deep crater, another steam and white smoke from various rents and fissures in its side, vermilion peaks, smoke and steam all rising into a sky of brilliant blue, and the atmosphere was so clear that I saw everything that was going on there quite distinctly, especially when I attained an altitude exceeding that of the curtain range. It was not for 2 days that I got a correct idea of its geographical situation, but I was not long in finding out that it was not Komonotaki. There is much volcanic activity about it. I saw a glare from it last night 30 miles away. The Ainos said that it was a god, but did not know its name, nor did the Japanese who were living under its shadow. At some distance from it in the interior rises a grand dome-like mountain, Shiribetsan, and the whole view is grand. A little beyond Mombetsu flows the river Osharu, one of the largest of the Yezo streams. It was much swollen by the previous day's rain, and as the ferry boat was carried away, we had to swim it, and the swim seemed very long. Of course, we and the baggage got very wet. The coolness with which the Aino guide took to the water without giving us any notice that its broad eddying flood was a swim and not a ford was very amusing. From the top of a steepish ascent beyond the Osharugawa, there is a view into what looks like a very lovely lake, with wooded promontories and little bays, and rocky capes in miniature, and little heights, on which Aino houses with tawny roofs are clustered. And then the track dips suddenly, and deposits one, not by a lake at all, but on Uzu Bay, an inlet to the Pacific, much broken up into coves, and with a very narrow entrance, only obvious from a few points. Just as the track touches the bay, there is a road post with a prayer wheel in it, and by the shore an upright stone of very large size, inscribed with Sanskrit characters, near to a stone staircase and a gateway in a massive stone-faced embarkment, which looked much out of keeping with the general wildness of the place. On a rocky promontory in a wooded cove there is a large, rambling house, greatly out of repair, inhabited by a Japanese man and his son, who are placed there to look after government interests, exiles among 500 Ainos. From among the number of rat-haunted rambling rooms which had once been handsome, I chose one opening on a yard or garden with some distorted yews in it, but found that the great gateway and the amado had no bolts, and that anything might be appropriated by anyone with dishonest intentions. But the housemaster and his son, who have lived for 10 years among the Ainos and speak their language, say that nothing is ever taken, and that the Ainos are thoroughly honest and harmless. Without this assurance I should have been distrustful of the number of white-mouthed youths who hung about in the listlessness and vacuity of savagery, if not of the bearded men who sat or stood about the gateway with children in their arms. Uzu is a dream of beauty and peace. There is not much difference between the height of high and low water on this coast, and the lake-like illusion would have been perfect had it not been that the rocks were tinged with gold for a foot or so above the sea by a delicate species of fucus. In the exquisite inlet where I spent the nights, trees and trailers drooped into the water and were mirrored in it, their green, heavy shadows lying sharp against the sunset gold and pink of the rest of the bay. Log canoes, with planks laced upon their gunwales to heighten them, were drawn upon a tiny beach of golden sand, and in the shadiest cove, moored to a tree, an antique and much-carved junk was floating double. Wooded rocky knolls with Aino huts, the vermilion peaks of the volcano of Uzutaki redder than ever in the sinking sun, a few Ainos mending their nets, a few more spreading edible seaweed out to dry, a single canoe breaking the golden mirror of the cove by its noiseless motion, a few Aino loungers with their mild-eyed melancholy faces and quiet ways suiting the quiet evening scene, the unearthly sweetness of a temple bell. This was all, and yet it was the loveliest picture I have seen in Japan. In spite of Ito's remonstrances and his protestations that an exceptionally good supper would be spoiled, I left my rat-haunted room, with its tarnished gilding and precarious fusuma, to get the last of the pink and lemon-colored glory, going up the staircase in the stone-faced embankment, and up a broad, well-paved avenue to a large temple, within whose open door I sat for some time absolutely alone and in wonderful stillness, for the sweet-toned bell, which vainly chimes for vespers amidst this bare worshipping population, had ceased. This temple was the first symptom of Japanese religion that I remember to have seen since leaving Hakodate, and worshippers have long since ebbed away from its shady and moss-grown courts. Yet it stands there to protest for the teaching of the great Hindu, and generations of Ainu heathen pass away one after another, and still its bronze bell tolls, and its altar lamps are lit, and incense burns forever before Buddha. The characters on the great bell of this temple are said to be the same lines which are often graven on temple bells, and to possess the dignity of 24 centuries. All things are transient. They, being born, must die, and being born are dead, and being dead are glad to be at rest. The temple is very handsome, the baldachino is superb, and the bronzes and brasses on the altar are specially fine. A broad ray of sunlight streamed in, crossed the matted floor, and fell full upon the figure of Sakyamuni in his golden shrine, and just at that moment a shaven priest in silk-brocaded vestments of faded green silently passed down the stream of light and lit the candles on the altar, and fresh incense filled the temple with a drowsy fragrance. It was a most impressive picture. His curiosity evidently shortened his devotions, and he came and asked me where I had been and where I was going, to which, of course, I replied in excellent Japanese, and then stuck fast. Along the paved avenue, besides the usual stone trough for holy water, there are on one side the 1,000-armed Kwannon, a very fine relief, and on the other a Buddha throned on the eternal lotus blossom with an iron staff, much resembling a crozier, in his hand, and that eternal apathy on his face which is the highest hope of those who hope at all. I went through a wood where there are some mournful groups of graves on the hillside, and from the temple came the sweet sound of the great bronze bell and the beat of the big drum, and then, more faintly, the sound of the little bell and drum, with which the priest accompanies his ceaseless repetition of a phrase in the dead tongue of a distant land. There is an infinite pathos about the lonely temple in its splendor, the absence of even possible worshippers, and the large population of Ainus, sunk in yet deeper superstitions than those which go to make up popular Buddhism. I sat on a rock by the bay till the last pink glow faded from Uzutaki and the last lemon stain from the still water, and a beautiful crescent which hung over the wooded hill had set, and the heavens blazed with stars. 10,000 stars were in the sky, 10,000 in the sea, and every wave with dimpled face that leapt upon the air had caught a star in its embrace and held it trembling there. The loneliness of Uzu Bay is something wonderful, a house full of empty rooms falling to decay with only 2 men in it, one Japanese house among 500 savages, yet it was the only one in which I have slept in which they bolted neither the amado nor the gate. During the night the amado fell out of the worn-out grooves with a crash, knocking down the shoji, which fell on me, and rousing Ito, who rushed into my room half asleep, with a vague vision of bloodthirsty Ainus in his mind. I then learned, what I have been very stupid not to have learned before, that in these sliding wooden shutters there is a small door through which one person can creep at a time, called the Jishindo, or earthquake door, because it provides an exit during the alarm of an earthquake, in case of the amado sticking in their grooves or the bolts going wrong. I believe that such a door exists in all Japanese houses. The next morning was as beautiful as the previous evening, rose and gold instead of gold and pink. Before the sun was well up, I visited a number of the Ainu lodges, saw the bear and the chief, who, like all the rest, is a monogamist, and after breakfast, at my request, some of the old men came to give me such information as they had. These venerable elders sat cross-legged in the veranda, the housemaster's son, who kindly acted as interpreter, squatting, Japanese fashion, at the side, and about 30 Ainus, mostly women with infants, sitting behind. I spent about 2 hours in going over the same ground as at Biratori, and also went over the words, and got some more, including some synonyms. The click of the TS before the CH at the beginning of a word is strongly marked among these Ainos. Some of their customs differ slightly from those of their brethren of the interior, especially as to the period of seclusion after a death, the non-allowance of polygamy to the chief, and the manner of killing the bear at the annual festival. Their ideas of metempsychosis are more definite, but this, I think, is to be accounted for by the influence and proximity of Buddhism. They spoke of the bear as their chief god, and next the sun and fire. They said that they no longer worship the wolf, and that though they call the volcano and many other things kamoi, or god, they do not worship them. I ascertained beyond doubt that worship with them means simply making libations of sake and drinking to the god, and that it is unaccompanied by petitions or any vocal or mental act. These Ainos are as dark as the people of southern Spain, and very hairy. Their expression is earnest and pathetic, and when they smiled, as they did when I could not pronounce their words, their faces had a touching sweetness which was quite beautiful, and European, not Asiatic. Their own impression is that they are now increasing in numbers after diminishing for many years. I left Uzu sleeping in the loveliness of an autumn noon with great regret. No place that I have seen has fascinated me so much. End of section 52. Section 53 of Unbeaten Tracks in Japan by Isabella L. Bird. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Awai in October 2012. Letter 40, Part 2. A charge of 3 sen per ri more for the horses for the next stage, because there were such bad mountains to cross, prepared me for what followed. Many miles of the worst road for horses I ever saw. I should not have complained if they had charged double the price. As an almost certain consequence, it was one of the most picturesque routes I have ever travelled. For some distance, however, it runs placidly along by the seashore, on which big, blue, foam-crested rollers were disporting themselves noisily, and passes through several Ainu hamlets, and the Ainu village of Abutta, with 60 houses, rather a prosperous-looking place, where the cultivation was considerably more careful, and the people possessed a number of horses. Several of the houses were surrounded by bears' skulls, grinning from between the forked tops of high poles, and there was a well-grown bear ready for his doom and apotheosis. In nearly all the houses a woman was weaving bark cloth, with the hook which holds the web fixed into the ground several feet outside the house. At a deep river called the Nopokobetse, which emerges from the mountains close to the sea, we were ferried by an Aino completely covered with hair, which on his shoulders was wavy like that of a retriever, and rendered clothing quite needless neither for covering or warmth. A wavy black beard rippled nearly to his waist over his furry chest, and with his black locks hanging in masses over his shoulders, he would have looked a thorough savage had it not been for the exceeding sweetness of his smile and eyes. The Volcano Bay Ainos are far more hairy than the mountain Ainos, but even among them it is quite common to see men not more so than vigorous Europeans, and I think that the hairiness of the race as a distinctive feature has been much exaggerated, partly by the smooth-skinned Japanese. The ferry scow was nearly upset by our 4 horses beginning to fight. At first one bit the shoulders of another, then the one attacked uttered sharp squeals, and returned the attack by striking with his forefeet, and then there was a general melee of striking and biting, till some ugly wounds were inflicted. I have watched fights of this kind on a large scale every day in the corral. The miseries of the Yezo horses are the great drawback of Yezo travelling. They are brutally used and are covered with awful wounds from being driven at a fast scramble, with the rude ungirthed pack saddle and its heavy load rolling about on their backs, and they are beaten unmercifully over their eyes and ears with heavy sticks. Ito has been barbarous to these gentle, little prized animals ever since we came to Yezo. He has vexed me more by this than by anything else, especially as he never dared even to carry a switch on the main island, either from fear of the horses or their owners. Today he was beating the baggage horse unmercifully, when I rode back and interfered with some very strong language, saying, "You are a bully, and, like all bullies, a coward." Imagine my aggravation when, at our first halt, he brought out his notebook, as usual, and quietly asked me the meaning of the words bully and coward. It was perfectly impossible to explain them, so I said a bully was the worst name I could call him, and that a coward was the meanest thing a man could be. Then the provoked boy said, "Is bully a worse name than devil?" "Yes, far worse," I said, on which he seemed rather crestfallen, and he has not beaten his horse since, in my sight at least. The breaking in process is simply breaking the spirit, by an hour or two of such atrocious cruelty as I saw at Shiraoi, at the end of which the horse, covered with foam and blood, and bleeding from mouth and nose, falls down exhausted. Being so ill-used, they have all kinds of tricks, such as lying down in fords, throwing themselves down head foremost and rolling over pack and rider, bucking and resisting attempts to make them go otherwise than in single file. Instead of bits, they have bars of wood on each side of the mouth, secured by a rope through the nose and chin. When horses which have been broken with bits gallop, they put up their heads till the nose is level with the ears, and it is useless to try either to guide or check them. They are always wanting to join the great herds on the hillside or seashore, from which they are only driven down as they are needed. In every Yezo village the first sound that one hears at break of day is the gallop of 40 or 50 horses, pursued by an Ainu, who has hunted them from the hills. A horse is worth from 28 shillings upwards. They are very sure-footed when their feet are not sore, and cross a stream or chasm on a single rickety plank, or walk on a narrow ledge above a river or gulch without fear. They are barefooted, their hoofs are very hard, and I am glad to be rid of the perpetual tying and untying and replacing of the straw shoes of the well-cared-for horses of the main island. A man rides with them, and for a man and 3 horses the charge is only 6d for each 2½ miles. I am now making Ito ride in front of me, to make sure that he does not beat or otherwise misuse his beast. After crossing the Nopkobetsu, from which the fighting horses have led me to make so long a digression, we went right up into the Bad Mountains, and crossed the 3 tremendous passes of Lebungetoge. Except by saying that this disused bridle track is impassable, people have scarcely exaggerated its difficulties. One horse broke down on the first pass, and we were long delayed by sending the Ainu back for another. Possibly these extraordinary passes do not exceed 1,500 feet in height, but the track ascends them through a dense forest with most extraordinary abruptness, to descend as abruptly, to rise again sometimes by a series of nearly washed-away zigzags, at others by a straight, ladder-like ascent deeply channeled, the bottom of the trough being filled with rough stones, large and small, or with ledges of rock with an entangled mass of branches and trailers overhead, which render it necessary to stoop over the horse's head while he is either fumbling, stumbling, or tumbling among the stones in a gash a foot wide, or else is awkwardly leaping up broken rock steps nearly the height of his chest, the whole performance consisting of a series of scrambling jerks at the rate of a mile an hour. In one of the worst places, the Ainu's horse, which was just in front of mine, in trying to scramble up a nearly breast-high and much-worn ledge, fell backwards, nearly overturning my horse, the stretcher poles, which formed part of his pack, striking me so hard above my ankle that for some minutes afterwards I thought the bone was broken. The ankle was severely cut and bruised and bled a good deal, and I was knocked out of the saddle. Ito's horse fell 3 times, and eventually the 4 were roped together. Such are some of the divertissements of Yezo travel. Ah, but it was glorious! The views are most magnificent. This is really paradise. Everything is here, huge headlands magnificently timbered, small deep bays into which the great green waves roll majestically, great grey cliffs, too perpendicular for even the most adventurous trailer to find roothold, bold bluffs and outlying stacks cedar-crested, glimpses of bright blue ocean dimpling in the sunshine or tossing up wreaths of foam among ferns and trailers, and inland ranges of mountains, forest-covered with tremendous gorges between, forest-filled, where wolf, bear and deer make their nearly inaccessible lairs, and outlying battlements, and ridges of grey rock with hardly 6 feet of level on their sinuous tops, and cedars in masses giving deep shadow, and sprays of scarlet maple or festoons of a crimson wine lightening the gloom. The inland view suggested infinity. There seemed no limit to the forest-covered mountains and the unlighted ravines. The wealth of vegetation was equal in luxuriance and entanglement to that of the tropics, primeval vegetation on which the lumberous axe has never rung. Trees of immense height and girth, especially the beautiful Salisburia adiantifolia, with its small fan-shaped leaves, all matted together by riotous lianas, rise out of an impenetrable undergrowth of the dwarf, dark-leaved bamboo, which, dwarf as it is, attains a height of 7 feet, and all is dark, solemn, soundless, the haunt of wild beasts, and of butterflies and dragonflies of the most brilliant colors. There was light without heat, leaves and streams sparkled, and there was nothing of the half-smothered sensation which is often produced by the choking greenery of the main island, for frequently, far below, the Pacific flashed in all its sunlit beauty, and occasionally we came down unexpectedly on a little cove with abrupt cedar-crested headlands and stacks, and a heavy surf rolling in with the deep thunder music which alone breaks the stillness of this silent land. There was one tremendous declivity where I got off to walk, but found it too steep to descend on foot with comfort. You can imagine how steep it was when I tell you that the deep groove being too narrow for me to get to the side of my horse, I dropped down upon him from behind, between his tail and the saddle, and so scrambled on. The sun had set, and the dew was falling heavily when the track dipped over the brow of a headland, becoming a waterway so steep and rough that I could not get down it on foot without the assistance of my hands, and terminating on a lonely little bay of great beauty, walled in by impracticable-looking headlands, which was the entrance to an equally impracticable-looking, densely wooded valley running up among densely wooded mountains. There was a margin of grey sand above the sea, and on this the skeleton of an enormous whale was bleaching. 2 or 3 large dugouts, with planks laced with stout fibre on their gunwales, and some bleached driftwood lay on the beach, the foreground of a solitary, rambling, dilapidated grey house, bleached like all else, where 3 Japanese men with an old Ainu servant live, to look after government interests, whatever these may be, and keep rooms and horses for government officials, a great boon to travellers who, like me, are belated here. Only 1 person has passed Lebunge this year, except 2 officials and a policeman. There was still a red glow on the water, and 1 horn of a young moon appeared above the wooded headland, but the loneliness and isolation are overpowering, and it is enough to produce madness to be shut in forever with the thunder of the everlasting surf, which compels one to raise one's voice in order to be heard. In the wood, half a mile from the sea, there is an Ainu village of 30 houses, and the appearance of a few of the savages gliding noiselessly over the beach in the twilight added to the ghastliness and loneliness of the scene. The horses were unloaded by the time I arrived, and several courteous Ainos showed me to my room, opening on a small courtyard with a heavy gate. The room was musty, and, being rarely used, swarmed with spiders. A saucer of fish oil and a wick rendered darkness visible, and showed faintly the dark, pathetic faces of a row of Ainos in the veranda, who retired noiselessly with their graceful salutation when I bade them good night. Food was hardly to be expected, yet they gave me rice, potatoes, and black beans boiled in equal parts of brine and syrup, which are very palatable. The cuts and bruises of yesterday became so very painful with the cold of the early morning that I have been obliged to remain here. ILB. End of section 53. Section 54 of Unbeaten Tracks in Japan by Isabella L. Bird. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Avai in October 2012. Letter 41. Hakodate, September 12. Lebunge is a much fascinating place in its awful isolation. The housemaster was a friendly man and much attached to the Ainos. If other officials entrusted with Ainu concerns treat the Ainos as fraternally as those of Uzu and Lebunge, there is not much to lament. This man also gave them a high character for honesty and harmlessness, and asked if they might come and see me before I left. So 20 men, mostly carrying very pretty children, came into the yard with the horses. They had never seen a foreigner, but, either from apathy or politeness, they neither stare nor press upon one as the Japanese do, and always make a courteous recognition. The bearskin housing of my saddle pleased them very much, and my boots of unblacked leather, which they compared to the deer-hide moccasins which they wear for winter hunting. Their voices were the lowest and most musical that I have heard, incongruous sounds to proceed from such hairy, powerful-looking men. Their love for their children was most marked. They caressed them tenderly and held them aloft for notice, and when the housemaster told them how much I admired the brown, dark-eyed, winsome creatures, their faces lighted with pleasure, and they saluted me over and over again. These, like other Ainos, utter a short screeching sound when they are not pleased, and then one recognizes the savage. These Lebunge Ainos differ considerably from those of the eastern villages, and I have again to notice the decided sound or click of the ts at the beginning of many words. Their skins are as swarthy as those of Bedouin, their foreheads comparatively low, their eyes far more deeply set, their stature lower, their hair yet more abundant, the look of wistful melancholy more marked, and two, who were unclothed for hard work in fashioning a canoe, were almost entirely covered with short black hair, specially thick on the shoulders and back, and so completely concealing the skin as to reconcile one to the lack of clothing. I noticed an enormous breadth of chest and a great development of the muscles of the arms and legs. All these Ainos shave their hair off for 2 inches above their brows, only allowing it there to attain the length of 1 inch. Among the well-clothed Ainos in the yard, there was one smooth-faced, smooth-skinned, concave-chested, spindle-limbed, yellow Japanese, with no other clothing than the decorated bark cloth apron which the Ainos wear in addition to their coats and leggings. Escorted by these gentle, friendly savages, I visited their lodges, which are very small and poor, and in every way inferior to those of the mountain Ainos. Their women are short and thick-set, and most uncomely. From their village I started for the longest, and by reputation the worst, stage of my journey, 17 miles, the first 10 of which are over mountains. So solitary and disused is this track that on a 4 days' journey we have not met a human being. In the Lebunge Valley, which is densely forested and abounds with fordable streams and treacherous ground, I came upon a grand specimen of the Salisburia adiantifolia, which, at a height of 3 feet from the ground, divides into 8 lofty stems, none of them less than 2 feet 5 inches in diameter. This tree, which grows rapidly, is so well adapted to our climate that I wonder it has not been introduced on a large scale, as it may be seen by everybody in Kew Gardens. There is another tree with orbicular leaves in pairs, which grows to an immense size. From this valley, a worn-out, stony bridle track ascends the western side of Lebungetoge, climbing through a dense forest of trees and trailers to a height of about 2,000 feet, where, contented with its efforts, it reposes, and, with only slight up and downs, continues along the top of a narrow ridge within the Seaward Mountains, between high walls of dense bamboo, which, for much of that day's journey, is the undergrowth alike of mountain and valley, ragged peak and rugged ravine. The scenery was as magnificent as on the previous day. A guide was absolutely needed, as the track ceased altogether in one place, and for some time the horses had to blunder their way along a bright, rushing river, swirling rapidly downwards, heavily bordered with bamboo, full of deep holes, and made difficult by trees which have fallen across it. There Ito, whose horse could not keep up with the others, was lost, or rather lost himself, which led to a delay of 2 hours. I have never seen grander forest than on that 2 days' ride. At last the track, barely passable after its recovery, dips over a precipitous bluff and descends close to the sea, which has evidently receded considerably. Thence it runs for 6 miles on a level, sandy strip, covered near the sea with a dwarf bamboo about 5 inches high, and farther inland with red roses and blue campanula. At the foot of the bluff there is a ruinous Japanese house, where an Ainu family has been placed to give shelter and rest to any who may be crossing the pass. I opened my bento bako of red lacquer, and found that it contained some cold, waxy potatoes, on which I dined, with the addition of some tea, and then waited wearily for Ito, for whom the guide went in search. The house and its inmates were a study. The ceiling was gone, and all kinds of things, for which I could not imagine any possible use, hung from the blackened rafters. Everything was broken and decayed, and the dirt was appalling. A very ugly Aino woman, hardly human in her ugliness, was splitting bark fibre. There were several irori, Japanese fashion, and at one of them a grand-looking old man was seated, apathetically contemplating the boiling of a pot. Old and sitting among ruins, he represented the fate of a race which, living, has no history, and perishing, leaves no monument. By the other irori sat, or rather crouched, the missing link. I was startled when I first saw it. It was, shall I say, a man, and the mate, I cannot write the husband, of the ugly woman. It was about 50. The lofty Aino brow had been made still loftier by shaving the head for 3 inches above it. The hair hung, not in shocks, but in snaky wisps, mingling with a beard which was grey and matted. The eyes were dark but vacant, and the face had no other expression than that look of apathetic melancholy which one sometimes sees on the faces of captive beasts. The arms and legs were unnaturally long and thin, and the creature sat with the knees tucked into the armpits. The limbs and body, with the exception of a patch on each side, were thinly covered with fine black hair, more than 1 inch long, which was slightly curly on the shoulders. It showed no other sign of intelligence than that evidenced by boiling water for my tea. When Ito arrived, he looked at it with disgust, exclaiming, "The Ainos are just dogs, they had a dog for their father," in allusion to their own legend of their origin. The level was pleasant after the mountains, and a canter took us pleasantly to Oshamambe, where we struck the old road from Mori to Satsuporo, and where I halted for a day to rest my spine, from which I was suffering much. Oshamambe looks dismal even in the sunshine, decayed and dissipated, with many people lounging about it, doing nothing, with the dazed look which overindulgence in sake gives to the eyes. The sun was scorching hot, and I was glad to find refuge from it in a crowded and dilapidated yadoya, where there were no black beans, and the use of eggs did not appear to be recognized. My room was only enclosed by shoji, and there were scarcely 5 minutes of the day in which eyes were not applied to the finger-holes with which they were liberally riddled, and during the night one of them fell down, revealing 6 Japanese sleeping in a row, each head on a wooden pillow. The grandeur of the route ceased with the mountain passes, but in the brilliant sunshine the ride from Oshamambe to Mori, which took me 2 days, was as pretty and pleasant as it could be. At first we got on very slowly, as besides my 4 horses there were 4 led ones going home, which got up fights and entangled their ropes, and occasionally lay down and rolled, and besides these there were 3 foals following their mothers, and if they stayed behind, the mares hung back neighing, and if they frolicked ahead, the mares wanted to look after them, and the whole string showed a combined inclination to dispense with their riders and join the many herds of horses which we passed. It was so tedious that, after enduring it for some time, I got Ito's horse and mine into a scow at a river of some size, and left the disorderly drove to follow at leisure. At Yurapu, where there is an Ainu village of 30 houses, we saw the last of the aborigines, and the interest of the journey ended. Strips of hard sand below high water mark, strips of red roses, ranges of wooded mountains, rivers deep and shallow, a few villages of old grey houses amidst grey sand and bleaching driftwood, and then came the river Yurapu, a broad deep stream, navigable in a canoe for 14 miles. The scenery there was truly beautiful in the late and splendid afternoon. The long blue waves rolled on shore, each one crested with light as it curled before it broke, and hurled its snowy drift for miles along the coast with a deep booming music. The glorious inland view was composed of 6 ranges of forest-covered mountains, broken, chasmed, caverned, and dark with timber, and above them bald grey peaks rose against the green sky of singular purity. I longed to take a boat up the Yurapu, which penetrates by many a gorge into their solemn recesses, but had no strength to carry my wish. After this I exchanged the silence or low musical speech of Aino guides for the harsh and ceaseless clatter of Japanese. At Yamakushinoi, a small hamlet on the seashore where I slept, there was a sweet, quiet yadoya, delightfully situated, with a wooded cliff at the back, over which a crescent hung out of pure sky, and besides there were the more solid pleasures of fish, eggs, and black beans. Thus, instead of being starved and finding wretched accommodation, the week I spent on Volcano Bay has been the best fed, as it was certainly the most comfortable week of my travels in northern Japan. Another glorious day favoured my ride to Mori, but I was unfortunate in my horse at each stage, and the Japanese guide was grumpy and ill-natured, a most unusual thing. Otoshibe and a few other small villages of grey houses with an ancient and fish-like smell lie along the coast, busy enough doubtless in the season, but now looking deserted and decayed, and houses are rather plentifully sprinkled among many parts of the shore, with a wonderful profusion of vegetables and flowers about them, raised from seeds liberally supplied by the Kaitakushi department from its Nanai experimental farm and nurseries. For a considerable part of the way to Mori there is no track at all, though there is a good deal of travel. One makes one's way fatiguingly along soft sea sand or coarse shingle close to the sea, or absolutely in it, under cliffs of hardened clay or yellow conglomerate, fording many small streams, several of which have cut their way deeply through a stratum of black volcanic sand. I have crossed about 100 rivers and streams on the Yezo coast, and all the larger ones are marked by a most noticeable peculiarity, that is, that on nearing the sea they turn south, and run for some distance parallel with it, before they succeed in finding an exit through the bank of sand and shingle which forms the beach and blocks their progress. On the way I saw 2 Ainus land through the surf in a canoe, in which they had paddled for nearly 100 miles. A river canoe is dug out of a single log, and 2 men can fashion one in 5 days, but on examining this one, which was 25 feet long, I found that it consisted of 2 halves, laced together with very strong bark fibre for their whole length, and with high sides also laced on. They consider that they are stronger for rough sea and surf work when made in 2 parts. Their bark fibre rope is beautifully made, and they twist it of all sizes, from twine up to a 9-inch hawser. Beautiful as the blue ocean was, I had too much of it, for the horses were either walking in a lather of sea foam or were crowded between the cliff and the sea, every larger wave breaking over my foot and irreverently splashing my face, and the surges were so loud-tongued and incessant, throwing themselves on the beach with a tremendous boom, and drawing the shingle back with them with an equally tremendous rattle, so impolite and noisy, bent only on showing their strength, reckless, rude, self-willed, and inconsiderate. This purposeless display of force and this incessant waste of power and the noisy self-assertion in both approach vulgarity. Towards evening we crossed the last of the bridgeless rivers and put up at Mori, which I left 3 weeks before, and I was very thankful to have accomplished my object without disappointment, disaster, or any considerable discomfort. Had I not promised to return Ito to his master by a given day, I should like to spend the next 6 weeks in the Yezo wilds, for the climate is good, the scenery beautiful, and the objects of interest are many. Another splendid day favoured my ride from Mori to Togenoshita, where I remained for the night, and I had exceptionally good horses for both days, though the one which Ito rode, while going at a rapid scramble, threw himself down 3 times and rolled over to rid himself from flies. I had not admired the wood between Mori and Ginzainoma, the lakes, on the sullen grey day on which I saw it before, but this time there was an abundance of light and shadow and solar glitter, and many a scarlet spray and crimson trailer, and many a maple flaming in the valleys, gladdened me with the music of colour. From the top of the pass beyond the lakes there is a grand view of the volcano in all its nakedness, with its lava beds and fields of pumice, with the lakes of Onuma, Konuma, and Ginzainoma, lying in the forests at its feet, and from the top of another hill there is a remarkable view of windy Hakodate, with its headland looking like Gibraltar. The slopes of this hill are covered with the Aconitum japonicum, of which the Ainus make their arrow poison. The yadoya at Togenoshita was a very pleasant and friendly one, and when Ito woke me yesterday morning, saying, "Are you sorry that it's the last morning?" "I am." I felt we had one subject in common, for I was very sorry to end my pleasant Yezo tour, and very sorry to part with the boy who had made himself more useful and invaluable even than before. It was most wearisome to have Hakodate in sight for 12 miles, so near across the bay, so far across the long, flat, stony strip which connects the headland upon which it is built with the mainland. For about 3 miles the road is rudely macadamized, and as soon as the barefooted horses get upon it, they seem lame of all their legs. They hang back, stumbling, dragging, edging to the side, and trying to run down every opening, so that when we got into the interminable main street, I sent Ito to the consulate for my letters, and dismounted, hoping that as it was raining I should not see any foreigners. But I was not so lucky, for first I met Mr. Denning, and then, seeing the consul and Dr. Hepburn coming down the road, evidently dressed for dining in the flagship and looking spruce and clean, I dodged up an alley to avoid them. But they saw me, and did not wonder that I wished to escape notice, for my old Beto's hat, my torn green paper waterproof, and my riding skirt and boots were not only splashed but caked with mud, and I had the general look of a person fresh from the wilds. ILB. Itinerary of tour in Yezo. Hakodate to Ginzainoma, 4 Japanese houses. 7 ri, 18 cho. Hakodate to Mori, 105 Japanese houses. 4 ri. Hakodate to Mororan, 57 Japanese houses. 11 ri. Hakodate to Horobetsu, 18 Japanese, 47 Ainu houses. 5 ri, 1 cho. Hakodate to Shiraoe, 11 Japanese, 51 Ainu houses. 6 ri, 32 cho. Hakodate to Tomakomai, 38 Japanese houses. 5 ri, 21 cho. Hakodate to Yubetsu, 7 Japanese, 3 Ainu houses. 3 ri, 5 cho. Hakodate to Sarufutto, 63 Japanese houses. 7 ri, 5 cho. Hakodate to Biratori, 53 Ainu houses. 5 ri. Hakodate to Mombetsu, 27 Japanese houses. 5 ri, 1 cho. From Horobetsu to Old Mororan, 9 Japanese, 30 Ainu houses. 4 ri, 28 cho. From Horobetsu to Uzu, 3 Japanese, 99 Ainu houses. 6 ri, 2 cho. From Horobetsu to Lebunge, 1 Japanese, 27 Ainu houses. 5 ri, 22 cho. From Horobetsu to Oshamambe, 56 Japanese, 38 Ainu houses. 6 ri, 34 cho. From Horobetsu to Yamakushinai, 40 Japanese houses. 4 ri, 18 cho. From Horobetsu to Otoshibe, 40 Japanese houses. 2 ri, 3 cho. From Horobetsu to Mori, 105 Japanese houses. 3 ri, 29 cho. From Horobetsu to Togenoshita, 55 Japanese houses. 6 ri, 7 cho. From Horobetsu to Hakodate, 37,000 souls. 3 ri, 29 cho. About 358 English miles. End of section 54. Section 55 of Unbeaten Tracks in Japan by Isabella L. Bird. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Avai in October 2012. Letter 42. Hakodate, Yezo, September 14, 1878. This is my last day in Yezo, and the sun, shining brightly over the grey and windy capital, is touching the pink peaks of Komonotaki with a deeper red, and is brightening my last impressions, which, like my first, are very pleasant. The bay is deep blue, flecked with violet shadows, and about 60 junks are floating upon it at anchor. There are vessels of foreign rig too, but the wan, pale junks lying motionless or rolling into the harbor under their great white sails fascinate me as when I first saw them in the Gulf of Yedo. They are antique-looking and picturesque, but are fitter to give interest to a picture than to battle with stormy seas. Most of the junks in the bay are about 120 tons burthen, 100 feet long, with an extreme beam far aft of 25 feet. The bow is long and curves into a lofty stem like that of a Roman galley, finished with a beak head to secure the forestay of the mast. This beak is furnished with 2 large goggle eyes. The mast is a ponderous spar, 50 feet high, composed of pieces of pine, pegged, glued, and hooped together. A heavy yard is hung amidships. The sail is an oblong of widths of strong white cotton, artistically puckered, not sewn together, but laced vertically, leaving a decorative lacing 6 inches wide between each 2 widths. Instead of reefing in a strong wind, a width is unlaced so as to reduce the canvas vertically, not horizontally. 2 blue spheres commonly adorn the sail. The mast is placed well abaft, and to tack or veer it is only necessary to reverse the sheet. When on a wind, the long bow and nose serve as a headsail. The high, square piled-up stern, with its antique carving, and the sides with their letter-work, are wonderful, together with the extraordinary size and projection of the rudder, and the length of the tiller. The anchors are of grapnel shape, and the larger junks have from 6 to 8 arranged on the fore end, giving one an idea of bad holding ground along the coast. They really are much like the shape of a Chinese small-footed woman's shoe and look very unmanageable. They are of unpainted wood and have a wintry, ghastly look about them. I have parted with Ito finally today, with great regret. He has served me faithfully, and on most common topics I can get much more information through him than from any foreigner. I miss him already, though he insisted on packing for me as usual and put all my things in order. His cleverness is something surprising. He goes to a good, manly master who will help him to be good and set him a virtuous example, and that is a satisfaction. Before he left, he wrote a letter for me to the governor of Mororan, thanking him on my behalf for the use of the kuruma and other courtesies. ILB. End of section 55. Section 56 of Unbeaten Tracks in Japan by Isabella L. Bird. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Avai in October 2012. Letter 43. HBM's Legation, Yedo, September 21st. A placid sea, which after much disturbance had sighed itself to rest, and a high, steady barometer promised a 50 hours passage to Yokohama, and when Dr. and Mrs. Hepburn and I left Hakodate by moonlight on the night of the 14th, as the only passengers in the Hyogo Maru, Captain Moore, her general, pleasant master, congratulated us on the rapid and delightful passage before us, and we separated at midnight with many projects for pleasant intercourse and occupation. But a more miserable voyage I never made, and it was not until the afternoon of the 17th that we crawled forth from our cabins to speak to each other. On the 2nd day out, great heat came on with suffocating closeness. The mercury rose to 85 degrees, and in latitude 38 degrees 0 minutes north, and longitude 141 degrees 30 minutes east, we encountered a typhoon, otherwise a cyclone, otherwise a revolving hurricane, which lasted for 25 hours and jettisoned the cargo. Captain Moore has given me a very interesting diagram of it, showing the attempts which he made to avoid its vortex, through which our course would have taken us, and to keep as much outside it as possible. The typhoon was succeeded by a dense fog, so that our 50-hour passage became 72 hours, and we landed at Yokohama near upon midnight on the 17th, to find traces of much disaster, the whole low-lying country flooded, the railway between Yokohama and the capital impassable, great anxiety about the rice crop, the air full of alarmist rumors, and paper money, which was about par when I arrived in May, at a discount of 13%. In the early part of this year, 1880, it has touched 42%. Late in the afternoon the railroad was reopened, and I came here with Mr. Wilkinson, glad to settle down to a period of rest and ease under this hospitable roof. The afternoon was bright and sunny, and Tokyo was looking its best. The long lines of yashikis looked handsome. The castle moat was so full of the gigantic leaves of the lotus that the water was hardly visible. The grass embankments of the upper moat were a brilliant green. The pines on their summits stood out boldly against a clear sky. The hill on which the legation stands looked dry and cheerful, and, better than all, I had a most kindly welcome from those who have made this house my home in a strange land. Tokyo is tranquil, that is, it is disturbed only by fears for the rice crop and by the fall in Satsu. The military mutineers have been tried, popular rumor says tortured, and 52 have been shot. The summer has been the worst for some years, and now dark heat, moist heat, and nearly ceaseless rain prevail. People have been reined up in their summer quarters. Surely it will change soon, people say, and they have said the same thing for 3 months. ILB. End of section 56. Section 57 of Unbeaten Tracks in Japan by Isabella L. Bird. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Avai in October 2012. Letter 44. HBM's Legation, Yedo, December 18. I have spent the last 10 days here in settled fine weather, such as should have begun 2 months ago if the climate had behaved as it ought. The time has flown by in excursions, shopping, select little dinner parties, farewell calls, and visits made with Mr. Chamberlain to the famous groves and temples of Ikegami, where the Buddhist bishop and priests entertained us in one of the guest rooms, and to Enoshima and Kamakura, vulgar resorts which nothing can vulgarize so long as Fujisan towers above them. I will mention but one site which is so far out of the beaten track that it was only after prolonged inquiry that its whereabouts were ascertained. Among Buddhists, especially of the Monto sect, cremation was largely practiced till it was forbidden 5 years ago, as some suppose in deference to European prejudices. 3 years ago, however, the prohibition was withdrawn, and in this short space of time the number of bodies burned has reached already 9,000 annually. Sir H. Parkes applied for permission for me to visit the Kirigaya ground, one of 5, and after a few delays it was granted by the governor of Tokyo at Mr. Mori's request. So, yesterday, attended by the legation linguist, I presented myself at the fine yashiki of the Tokyo Fu, and, quite unexpectedly, was admitted to an audience of the governor. Mr. Kusamoto is a well-bred gentleman, and his face expresses the energy and ability which he has given proof of possessing. He wears his European clothes becomingly, and in attitude as well as manner is easy and dignified. After asking me a great deal about my northern tour and the Ainus, he expressed a wish for candid criticism, but as this in the East must not be taken literally, I merely ventured to say that the roads lag behind the progress made in other directions, upon which he entered upon explanations which doubtless apply to the past road history of the country. He spoke of cremation and its necessity in large cities, and terminated the interview by requesting me to dismiss my interpreter and kuruma, as he was going to send me to Meguro in his own carriage with one of the government interpreters, adding very courteously that it gave him pleasure to show his attention to a guest of the British minister, for whose character and important services to Japan he has a high value. An hour's drive, with an extra amount of yelling from the bettos, took us to a suburb of little hills and valleys, where red camellias and feathery bamboo against backgrounds of cryptomeria contrast with the grey monotone of British winters, and alighting at a farm road too rough for a carriage, we passed through fields and hedgerows to an erection which looks too insignificant for such solemn news. Don't expect any ghastly details. A longish building of wattle and dab, much like the northern farmhouses, a high roof, and chimneys resembling those of the oast houses in Kent, combine with the rural surroundings to suggest farm buildings rather than the funeral pyre, and all that is horrible is left to the imagination. The end nearest the road is a little temple, much crowded with images, and small, red earthenware urns and tongs for sale to the relatives of deceased persons, and beyond this are 4 rooms with earthen floors and mud walls, nothing noticeable about them except the height of the peaked roof and the dark color of the plaster. In the middle of the largest are several pairs of granite supports at equal distances from each other, and in the smallest there is a solitary pair. This was literally all that was to be seen. In the large room several bodies are burnt at one time, and the charge is only 1 yen, about 3 shillings 8 pounds, solitary cremation costing 5 yen. Faggots are used, and 1 shilling worth ordinarily suffices to reduce a human form to ashes. After the funeral service in the house, the body is brought to the cremation ground, and is left in charge of the attendant, a melancholy, smoked-looking man, as well he may be. The richer people sometimes pay priests to be present during the burning, but this is not usual. There were 5 quick tubs of pine hooped with bamboo in the larger room, containing the remains of coolies, and a few oblong pine chests in the small rooms containing those of middle-class people. At 8 p.m. each coffin is placed on the stone trestles, the faggots are lighted underneath, the fires are replenished during the night, and by 6 a.m. that which was a human being is a small heap of ashes, which is placed in an urn by the relatives and is honorably interred. In some cases, the priests accompany the relations on this last mournful errand. 13 bodies were burnt the night before my visit, but there was not the slightest odor in or about the building, and the interpreter told me that, owing to the height of the chimneys, the people of the neighborhood never experience the least annoyance, even while the process is going on. The simplicity of the arrangement is very remarkable, and there can be no reasonable doubt that it serves the purpose of the innocuous and complete destruction of the corpse, as well as any complicated apparatus, if not better, while its cheapness places it within the reach of the class which is most heavily burdened by ordinary funeral expenses. This morning the governor sent his secretary to present me with a translation of an interesting account of the practice of cremation and its introduction into Japan. SS Volga, Christmas Eve, 1878. The snowy dome of Fujisan, reddening in the sunrise, rose above the violet woodlands of Mississippi Bay as we steamed out of Yokohama on the 19th, and 3 days later I saw the last of Japan, a rugged coast lashed by a wintry sea. ILB. End of section 57. End of Unbeaten Tracks in Japan by Isabella L. Bird. Thanks for listening.